But there is also a second element which we tend to ignore. I should say, most discourse about arms in the United States today tends to ignore. From a philosophical point of view, the discussion of arms in the United States today takes place, or at least when we're talking about a philosophy of government, the discussion of arms takes place in conjunction with the idea of power. An armed citizenry will have enough power to overthrow a tyranny. But that ignores a vital element which the Founding Fathers saw, which was that people who were unarmed were deemed not to have the virtue required of Republican citizens. Only citizens who were armed to defend themselves and their property had the moral fiber necessary to be good citizens in a republic. And to the Founding Fathers, the idea that Republican government was in danger, the idea was that Republican government was a very perilous enterprise, and it depended first and foremost on the moral fiber of its citizenry. The Militia Concept, which is part of that moral fiber and part as well of a philosophy of power, or a philosophy related to power, the Militia Concept was that you had the basic military component of society was the entire armed citizenry, composed of individuals who had the moral fiber based upon being armed, which also gave them the power to defend themselves and their families and their property from criminals and from the state. And by the same token, they had the moral fiber to join with other citizens like themselves in defending all citizens from tyranny, whether it be external or internal, and also from criminal misconduct, which was viewed as yet another form of lawlessness. Because to the Founding Fathers, and indeed to everyone 200 years ago, the most elemental and basic philosophical right was the right of self-defense. And we find that right used again and again in the works of the various Republican philosophers, principally or most notably John Locke, whose basis for the idea of overthrowing kings, the right of the public, the right of the people to overthrow an unjust ruler, a philosophical view he championed, and of course was highly controversial in his time for doing so. Self-defense was the basis of that view. The fact was, said Locke, that God has given man arms with which to defend his property and his life and his family. And any tyrant who would take from him his liberty or his property or his life is no different from a robber. Robbers may be resisted to the death, so therefore may rulers be resisted to the death, for they are but robbers when they attempt to tyrannize over the people. And when they take that which God has given you, you have the right from God, whether or not we happen to believe in any God today, not a subject I'm about to discourse on, but in any event, that was his view. Now, at the same time, the Republicans, particularly Locke, were very concerned with another notion, or were very concerned with an accusation which they tended to receive And that accusation was that they were an accusation not unknown to us today in a rather different context, but the accusation was that by encouraging the people to have arms and to believe in revolution, the Republicans were going to produce anarchy, they were going to produce bloodshed, there would be at all times a risk of revolution and revolt that was morally unacceptable. And like many arguments from that period, I think you can see the relationship to some arguments we have today, and the response was the same response in a somewhat different form that we have today. Locke's proposition was that if the people be armed, there will be no need for revolution, because government must always be terrified into recognizing the people's rights. And if the people are armed, government will be terrified, and government will not attempt to overthrow the rights of the people. Whereas if the people are not armed, government, which is inherently tyrannous, will progress further and further and further, or regress, if you will, toward destroying the rights of the people, that eventually the unarmed people will rise, and then you will have a war of extermination which will produce far more bloodshed than any temporary, and indeed Locke would have said quite unlikely, revolutionary outburst that might be occasioned from the people being armed, because, again, if the people are armed, they need not fear government. Now, obviously, that kind of thinking is far from where we are today, when we are told that assault rifles must be banned, not because I think anyone has much confidence that that will actually take assault rifles away from criminals, but for a more basic reason, which is that people should not have weapons equal to those of government. That is, I believe, the most basic, the common sense basis, and I use the word common sense in quotes, for the assault rifle controversy. Modern liberals, I would say pseudo-liberals, have come to see government as the only proper repository of force. Ramsey Clark, for instance, in arguing that all guns, not just assault rifles, but all guns, should be banned, says that it is abhorrent, it is unpatriotic to believe that people should defend themselves. That is the first duty of government, is to defend people, and I'm more or less paraphrasing him literally. If you see a leap here, that is Mr. Clark's fault, it's not mine. And since it is the first duty of government to defend the people, they must give up their arms because I guess they must presume that government will defend them, even if it isn't doing an adequate job of doing so. Now, in this connection, well, actually, let me also talk about Gary Wills, whose view is that it is immoral for people to think of, for them just to contemplate having arms to defend their families. That is morally repugnant. Presumably, what he means is that they should depend on government to defend them, although He has not fully explained his theory, nor why it is. I mean, his theory is expressed basically in a series of epithets you will find in his columns about gun nuts and thinking of how immoral it is for them to be gun nuts, etc. And he certainly hasn't explained what seems to me a difficult proposition, which is that if it's immoral to contemplate having a gun to defend your family, why isn't it immoral to contemplate calling on somebody else with a gun to defend your family? If one takes him seriously, then one would have to assume that the American public was most irrationally agitated about the question of Lieutenant Calley and Miley, and the concern that General Westmoreland was not being punished for the atrocities that allegedly he had ordered, for in fact, it was perfectly all right for General Westmoreland to order Lieutenant Calley to commit atrocities. It would only have been wrong if General Westmoreland had committed the atrocities himself. In any event, that is the liberal philosophy.